Hope everybody's doing good this afternoon. I am doing this video from my office today for our online lecture this evening. Excuse me. I think it'll be fairly short. I'm just going to be introducing a couple of documents that I have listed on the blog. A couple of things that you're going to need for this next essay. Really quick, let's just dive into it. Under the Monday blog that I posted, where it has the Ernest Hemingway bio, which you guys should be watching for tonight, or you know, it's like an hour long video, so just make sure that you watch it. It's really gonna benefit you, especially those students that don't want to really mess with the literary devices terms and definitions portion of the essay, or which is optional, I should say. It's going to benefit you because you're going to know some of the biography related to why he wrote some of the stories. So, given that information, you're going to want to, again, know sort of his influences, the backstory for some of the stuff that he's writing about. In terms of kind of contextualizing, and I'll talk about contextualizing the story in a bit when we get to those portions of the terms. So right now, what I'd like for you to do, if you have the if you have the blogger up and running, is under the Monday blog. I have again the video for the bio, and then there's another one right underneath. That says you'll need to have an understanding of the following terms and definitions. Go ahead and click on that. Click here for lit terms and devices. So these are the two documents that we're going to be going over in this video. And again, it should be fairly short, and it's going to be to the point, I think. And unfortunately, we're not going to have time to cover all of this stuff in class, and that's why I'm needing to do this online. There's a lot of things that have come up this summer that I need to tend to, and unfortunately, it's material that I'm not able to cover during class. So I think this will help out. The first one that we want to look at is the elements of a story. Excuse me. And if you've ever took maybe an English class in high school, you might remember some of this, some of these terms and definitions. I don't expect you to know all of this stuff, but for the most part, I'm going to cover kind of the essential or the major kind of concepts that I'd like for you to know for a comparison and contrast essay. So there's 5 elements of a fiction that's stated on here, and we have the plot, setting, character, point of view, and theme. Just like if you were to watch any movie, or if you were to read any book, most of what comprises these forms of aesthetic works or art or films carry either some or all of these characteristics. So this, and again, these might be things that you're already kind of aware of. And the worksheets that I have up here, which you can download and you can print on your own, we'll be going and discussing the stories according to to these definitions. So we'll start with plot here, and the definition that we have here for plot, and again, you might be able to find these same elements like somewhere else online or something like that, but I think I managed to get these off the internet, and I think we're fairly simple to talk about. So plot is how the author arranges events to develop the basic idea, the way events are sequenced in a story or a play. Basically, what if anybody were to ask you, well, what was a movie about? And I guess just really quick, one movie that comes to mind is like the Avengers movies, right? The Avengers movies, depending on which one you watch, is pretty much a cast of superheroes. right? Going against the plot pretty much would be like good versus evil or something like that, right? Um, but again, pretty much think about it that way. Think about it as far as what the story, what the film, what the play is basically about. What's the plot? What's going on? Pretty much. Um, the expository, rising action, and conflict stuff is stuff that I don't necessarily need for you to know. During class, I'll cover the way the expository sort of line goes, and pretty much if you're familiar with any type again of film or story, there's always a beginning, a middle, and an end, and there's always something that happens within the story or the film that causes some sort of conflict, and once that conflict comes to its sort of pinnacle, we call that the climax or something, right? You've heard of that before. And then after that, there has to be some sort of resolution, and then the end, pretty much the end of the story. Now, I'm not saying that all films or stories work the same way. If you've ever seen a film like Pulp Fiction is a film that is arranged in a totally unique way that hadn't been done in film before. It may have been done, but not the way to the extent that Tarantino kind of went through it. So again, that'll be something that we'll discuss during class as well. But again, kind of going through this worksheet, we're looking at the exposition as the introduction or the beginning of the story, where you have the cast of characters, the background. In other words, pretty much the context of what is happening or what's about to happen, or sort of the beginning of the story that's gonna kind of move forward. That's followed by conflict, and again, something within the story, something has to happen within there, and this goes for anything that you watch that happens, right? Any type of movie that you know that has to go against, I guess, your main characters. So under conflict, we have different types of conflict. We have an internal conflict, which is a struggle within oneself, right? So we can think of maybe Superman, for example, right? Superman, Clark, or whatever, is this superhuman being that came from Krypton and was raised by a farming family, and typical, right? Sort of the story would be a farming family. It wouldn't be somebody else that wouldn't be a city person so again, it sort of makes for an interesting story. So, when we are talking about conflict with regards to Clark Kent and Superman, it's a struggle within himself not to sort of make his powers known to everybody, and sort of a way to actually control and sort of have power over himself and the things that he's able to do. You can look at any superhero movie, and it's sort of the same type of inner sort of conflict going on. If you think about Spider-Man, there was always, again, Uncle Ben, that would always tell him, you have to make sure that with great power comes great responsibility, that sort of thing. So again, think of internal conflict in the same way. Character versus self. So this is another, I guess, again, the same thing. Struggles within, with their own soul, physical limitation, choices, and things like that. So we also have an external conflict, which is a struggle with forces outside of oneself. And again, if we're talking about superheroes, and we're talking about, well, who's the opposing character in Superman or Spider-Man, right? Well, there are several, probably. Lex Luthor for Superman. I can't really remember any others, but so it's going to be man versus somebody else, or an outside force. Now, the outside force, the external conflict, doesn't have to be a person. It can actually be a thing, or an idea, or a concept. So under external conflicts, we have character versus character. In other words, the struggles against other people. We have character versus nature, struggles against animals, weather, environment. So there's plenty of stories that have this conflict. Think of Moby Dick, Melville's Moby Dick, which is Captain Ahab versus the big whale that he's trying that he's obsessed over and trying to kill, right? So that's man versus nature. Or think of just, maybe stories where there's like a storm involved or something like that. There was a famous movie in the 80s called Twister. So again, that you might see that as man versus nature, right? There's also character or man versus society, struggles against ideas, practices, or customs of others. Um, I'm trying to think of something, not maybe Uncle Tom's Cabin or something like that. A character that struggles with concepts or ideas that maybe one is not used to, and there's plenty of them, plenty of stories out there. I think more than anything, the stories that I sort of think about are sort of the Chicano kind of literature, Chicano genre, Mexican American literature genre. Someone like Gloria Anzaldúa, who unfortunately we didn't talk about this semester, but in her book La Frontera, Borderlands y La Frontera, the whole book is sort of surrounded by her as a gay lesbian Chicana. Mind you, she was an author from the Valley, from Edinburgh. But throughout the whole, story, there is, she talks about the struggle that she had as a person of color, a person who is gay, and a person that's living here in the Valley, which makes it even more specific as to the type of the type of conflicts that she had to endure through her upbringing. So even though it's a nonfiction book, it's still you sort of still find those elements of her against the societies and the way that we think of our culture, especially a culture that we come from as Mexican Americans, or Mexican culture, the machista culture. Think of it in that sense. All right. So moving along, I want to go ahead and just move along here. Again, it'll be things that we'll talk about during our lecture on the stories. Number 3, there is climax, which is this is a point in the story where something has to happen in order to move it forward. There has to be some sort of conflict in anything that you watch in order to make the story interesting, right? Without conflict, there is, right? In other words, without struggle or inner struggle, there is, we're left with nothing, and we're sort of left with, okay, well, now what, right? What kind of a life would we have if we didn't have any obstacles in front of us that were, that would either change us or sort of give us a new perspective or outlook on anything, right? So again, this happens in stories, and they're intentional, and again, these are things that we'll talk about. Falling action again is sort of I'll do a little not necessarily a chart, but sort of a drawing that illustrates the beginning, the conflict, and climax, and the falling action. In other words, these things have to happen within the story in order to make it just kind of continue and sort of just go, right. At the end, number 5, we have the resolution or the conclusion, and that's the final outcome of every story. So again, we'll start with plot. Plot entails all of these things that I just mentioned right now. Roman numeral number 2 has a setting. Setting is very, very simple to think about, guys. Where was this at? When did this occur? What is happening during that time as far as context surrounding the story? If we're looking at stories like A Soldier's Home, for example, I think that one takes place post World War II. So again, creating some sort of setting for whatever it is that we're watching, right? And again, that's fairly easy to sort of talk about. Some of Hemingway's stories that we'll be talking about take place in Michigan. So, for example, Indian Camp and The End of Something are sort of follow-up stories that take place in the same time and with the same characters also. And we'll get into that next, right? Roman number 3 is talking about characters who are or are characters. When we look at characters, we look at protagonists and the antagonists. In other words, normally our protagonist is our main character. The antagonist is a person or a place or thing or something that's going to go against the main character. Any other characters involved in a story are sort of referred to as minor characters. Um, Unless they play a really important piece or aspect in the actual storyline, then we look at them as sort of minor characters. All right. The way that we characterize these characters, can be through different ways, and under Roman numeral 3, number 3, we describe characters as being round, flat, dynamic, or static. And again, I'm still referring to the to the worksheet that we have listed on there. By a round character, we have a character that's fully developed. Their personalities that are affected by the story's events, they can learn, grow, or deteriorate by the end of the story. Characters are most convincing when they resemble real people by being consistent, motivated, and lifelike. So those are round characters, kind of fully developed characters, right? That we know about. Flat characters are one-dimensional characters that maybe we don't necessarily know about, or they're minor characters. A dynamic character is a character who goes through change and grows during the story. So in other words, Spider-Man, again, another example. What we think of as the origin story of Spider-Man. He gains his powers, realizes something about him. Uncle Ben passes on or whatever, and he sort of wants to get revenge for what happened to Uncle Ben, and sort of throughout the whole kind of storyline, he comes to find out that revenge is sort of not the answer, and sort of at the end he's left with another kind of I guess perception of the world, or perception of who he is and what he should be doing with these special powers. So again, that Uncle Ben sort of says, with great power comes responsibility. All that stuff sort of sticks in his mind at the end. And Spider-Man kind of becomes that dynamic character who at the end sort of grows. There's a lot of characters that you can go through in a storyline where you can say that. In other words, if the character goes throughout the whole story and at the end doesn't change, then we look at that character as a static person or a static character, right? There has to be some sort of change that happens throughout the story in order for that character to be a dynamic character. All right, Roman numeral number 4 is point of view. We have first person, second person, third person, limited, omniscient. You guys can go ahead and go through that. Generally, again, and we actually use this whenever we're writing our essays also. For example, our group essay, for the most part, I think I wanted you guys to write this as as us and we, etc. So to think of that particular essay, we wrote that one in sort of a third person kind of perspective. Generally, if you're writing a narrative essay about yourself or your experiences and sort of your subjective kind of nature and what you think and your beliefs, you're writing all that in first person. So characters are written in these type of in these perspectives also. We're not going to get too much into this. You're not. I don't need for you guys to know all of this, but again, you can go through this on your own. Stream of consciousness is one that Hemingway sort of employs in his stories, and whenever we see that, I'll make sure to make sure to point that out. Roman numeral 5 is talking about theme. And when we talk about theme, or the way that I want you to think about theme, is what are the major kind of concepts? In other words, after you seen a movie or read a book, what do you think are the major thematic elements? In other words, what did you learn? What is the moral of the story? what are some of the underlying meanings that the filmmaker, the author may have had when doing this, or when presenting a film like that. Um, again, sometimes they're not all going to be the same. We have love stories. We have, if we look at the way the Greeks kind of conceive these, think about our tragedies, think about our histories, think about our dramas, and all of these. So under number 3 and Roman numeral 5, we have examples of common themes occurring in literature and television and film. Things are not always as they appear to be. Love is blind. Believe in yourself. People are afraid of change. Don't judge a book by its cover, etc. I think for the most part, those are the ones. I mean, I have more. There's more examples in the second and third, and actually for the rest of the documents. But I'm not gonna have you guys really, you can look on those on your own if you want. But those are the major kind of concepts that I want to talk about, with reference to the 5 elements of fiction. All right. So let's go ahead and move on to our next document. You can just press escape and it'll take you to the next page, or back to where we're at, and click on the literary terms. All right. Now again, I'm going to give you guys the option to write this essay and compare and do your comparisons a couple of different ways. One way that you're going to be doing this is by looking at contextual evidence or contextual information. And what I mean by contextual information is, how is it, or do your comparisons of each story based on what you know about the author, about what was happening during the time the author was alive, about some of the things that influence the author. So by contextualizing your paper, by doing your paper under a contextualized kind of lens, I always talk about kind of look at the stories with this type of lens, right? You're looking for examples within the story that are related to contextual evidence. In other words, real life sort of examples or influence, how the author was influenced, what was happening during the time that the author wrote this. All of these things are important as contextual evidence to why these people wrote what they wrote. And again, we're talking about, in this case, Hemingway and Chopin. Now, the second option that you guys will have is to look at literary terms and devices and see how both stories are sort of similar and or maybe different. So the following that I have here in this particular worksheet is a glossary of literary terms. Now, again, I'm not going to go over all of these, and there's a bunch of them. If you're going to be an English teacher, or if you're going to teach one day or another, you might need to know this stuff. So again, that's why, I know some of you guys are going into business or engineering and computers and stuff like that. It's not necessary that you guys really need to know all of this stuff. But I think it's kind of important, and it is a way for us to sort of compare and contrast any work of fiction or any film, and or things of that matter. I guess I'm going to go over the most important stuff that you normally find in a story. And while we're talking about these stories in class, or while we're discussing them, I'm going to point out to some of this stuff. So I'd like for you guys to actually have a copy of this with you, or have it as part of, again, your laptop and stuff, so that you guys can know where these devices are applied in the story. So again, right now is just an introduction to these devices, but once we actually start talking about the stories, then I'll tell you, okay, this is a part where you can find alliteration. This part is allusion, or this is a flashback, etc. So let's go over some of these real quick. Alliteration is found a lot in poetry. The repetition of initial consonant sounds I'm trying to think of something. Oh, well, there's examples here. The fair breeze blew the white foam and flew. So the F word flew, foam, figure or something, is giving that repetition, that alliteration. So whenever you see that in a work, especially in poetry or literature, you know where that is found. An illusion, not an illusion. An illusion is what magicians or those people that deal in illusion kind of do. Is separate, is a different thing than allusion. An allusion starting with an A is a reference to something. If you've ever heard, I'm alluding to this, I'm alluding to that. Well, I'm referencing this, I'm referencing that. Allusions are found everywhere in literature. So, allusion is a reference to a well known person, place, event, literary work, or something. Again, um, characterization, we'll skip through that. Flashbacks. Flashbacks are definitely occur a lot in things you might, just by watching movies and things like that. The flashback is really prominent in especially films and or TV. um, Figurative language like simile, metaphor, hyperbole, personification. A simile is a comparison of two things. Think of simile as this as the same, right? Or similar, right? Generally, a simile, it'll be followed by something like with the word like or as. Her eyes were as blue as the sky or something like that, right? So that's a simile. The only thing is and kind of moving on to the next metaphor. A metaphor is sort of like a simile, but it's a comparison of two things that are essentially different. And a metaphor can be something like a metaphor can sorry about a message. A metaphor can be something like that. What I just said, right? Her eyes are deep oceans of a deep oceans and deep ocean waves or something like that. Um, we know that that's not a literal interpretation. That's just sort of it's a metaphor to say something about her eyes. Her eyes resemble crashing waves or something like that. It's just a way to use emotion and or visualization to something and give it I don't know, give it more sort of substance or something like that. So think of metaphor in that same respect. Hyperbole is like an over exaggeration. Hyperbole is something like it's raining cats and dogs. It's not literally raining cats and dogs. It's a metaphor, right? That's a metaphor. But a hyperbole is an over exaggeration. It's also something that is like it couldn't possibly be real. Personification is attributing human qualities to objects, animals, or ideas. There is an example there that says the wind exhaled, right? The wind doesn't exhale. That's not something that actually happens. um, Foreshadowing is like a hint that something is going to happen later on. There are a lot of stories where, especially you'll know these whenever you see something in a film or something, and you're like, oh, I know what's going to happen, right? Is because something is telling you within the story that is giving you some sort of idea or hint that something is about to occur. In the story The Storm, for example, there's big foreshadowing there. And I'm not going to talk about it right now, but think of The Storm as foreshadowing for something that was going to happen later on in the story. Imagery is just things that what's happening in the background, sort of what is the imagery that's presented whenever you read a sentence. Hemingway does this, is really great at doing this. At the end of Indian Camp, there's a bunch of imagery that didn't happen within the first or within the whole pretty much short story. The imagery that we get is only at the very end of Indian Camp. Um, irony, onomatopoeia, point of view. I guess I'll have you guys look at all that stuff again. For most of you, this is stuff that you won't ever use in your life. But it's kind of cool to sort of talk about this in respect of these stories, and I think you'll have a new appreciation for stuff, or for stories and film, especially reading, and those of you that have problems with reading and sort of don't like it so much. Um, these terms will help you sort of clarify and kind of be like, oh, okay, well, that's kind of cool that writers and people who actually work on things like stuff like this, like creative stuff like this, kind of know and employ, and those are sort of our tools that we use in order to create the things that we do, right? And I'm saying we because I also I write, not to I'm not I'm not no Hemingway or Chopin or anything like that, but again, this stuff is stuff that that we learned and should be familiar with as teachers of literature and the film. Um, the second, I guess, really the most I kind of want you guys to know is that first page, along with style, suspense, and symbol. And we'll be talking about these later on. But again, this is a fairly short video that's an introduction to our literary terms and devices. If you have any questions on any of this stuff, just feel free to leave me a comment on the bottom. Otherwise, again, we will talk about these terms during class next time that we meet. So I hope that you guys have a good night. Make sure that you guys are keeping up with your stuff, and I'll see you next class period.